Okay, how's it going, everybody? We're going to get back into some Lenin, and we're going to keep reading this book here, or this. This was published in Pravda. Um, I guess it was a pamphlet published according to the text of the pamphlet. So this is the immediate task of the Soviet government. We're going to read this first section here, and we're going to read the second section because it's really short. This is the international position of the Russian Soviet Republic and the fundamental task of the socialist revolution. And then the next, the second part we're going to read is the general slogan of the moment, because it's about the same length, it seems like, or it's a shorter length than, this first one. We'll go ahead and read it, or I think the rest of them is shorter than the rest of them. So we're going to go ahead and read this very first one. These very first two. This is the international position of the Russian Soviet Republic, the fundamental task of the socialist revolution. Also, this was written in March through April of 1918. So let's go ahead. Thanks to the peace which has been achieved, despite its extremely onerous character and extreme instability, the Russian Soviet Republic has gained an opportunity to concentrate its efforts for a while on the most important and most difficult aspect of the socialist revolution, namely, the task of organization. This task was clearly and definitely set before all the working and oppressed people in the fourth paragraph, part 4, of the resolution adopted at the Extraordinary Congress of Soviets in Moscow in March 15, 1918. In that paragraph, or part, which speaks on the self-discipline of the working people and the ruthless struggle against chaos and disorganization. Of course, the peace achieved by Russian Soviet Republic is unstable, not because she is now thinking of resuming military operations, apart from bourgeois counter-revolutionaries and their henchmen, the Mensheviks and others. No sane politician thinks of doing that. The instability of the peace is due to the fact that in the imperialist states bordering on Russia to the west and the east, which command enormous military forces, the military party, tempted by Russia's momentary weakness and egged on by capitalists, who hate socialism and are eager for plunder, may gain the upper hand at any moment. Under these circumstances, the only real, not paper, guarantee of peace we have is the antagonism among the imperialist powers, which has reached extreme limits, and which is apparent on the one hand in the resumption of the imperialist butchery of the peoples in the West, and on the other hand in the extreme intensification of imperialist rivalry between Japan and America for supremacy in the Pacific and the Pacific coast, and on the Pacific coast. It goes without saying that with such an unreliable guard for protection, our Soviet Socialist Republic is in an extremely unstable and certainly critical international position. All our efforts must be exerted to the very utmost to make use of the respite given us by the combination of circumstances, so that we can heal the very severe wounds inflicted by the war upon the entire social organism of Russia, and bring about an economic revival, without which a real increase in our country's defense potential is inconceivable. It also goes without saying that we shall be able to render effective assistance to the socialist revolution in the West, which has been delayed for a number of reasons, only to the extent that we are able to fulfill the task of organization confronting us. A fundamental condition for the successful accomplishment of the primary task of organization confronting us is that the people's political leaders, i.e., the members of the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, and following them all the class-conscious representatives of the mass of the working people, shall fully appreciate the radical distinction in this respect between previous bourgeois revolutions and the present socialist revolution. In bourgeois revolutions, the principal task of the mass of working people was to fulfill the negative or destructive work of abolishing feudalism, monarchy, and medievalism. The positive or constructive work of organizing the new society was carried out by the property-owning bourgeois minority of the population. And the latter carried out this task with relative ease, despite the resistance of the workers and the poor peasants. Not only because the resistance of the people exploited by capital was then extremely weak, since they were scattered and uneducated, but also because the chief organizing force of anarchically built capitalist society is the spontaneously growing and expanding national and international market. Every socialist revolution, however, and consequently in the socialist revolution in Russia, which we began on October 25th in 1917, the principal task of the proletariat and of the poor peasants which it leads is the positive or constructive work of setting up an extremely intricate and delicate system of new organizational relationships extending to the planned production and distribution of the goods required for the existence of tens of millions of people. Such a revolution can be successfully carried out only if the majority of the population, and primarily the majority of the working people, engage in independent creative work as makers of history. Only if the proletariat and the poor peasants display sufficient class consciousness, devotion to principle, self-sacrifice, and perseverance will the victory of the socialist revolution be assured, by creating a new Soviet type of state, which gives the working and oppressed people the chance to take an active part in the independent building up of a new society. We solved only a small part of this difficult problem. The principal difficulty lies in the economic sphere, namely, the introduction of the strictest and universal accounting and control of the production and distribution of goods, raising the productivity of labor, and socializing production and practice. The development of the Bolshevik Party, which today is the governing party in Russia, very strikingly indicates the nature of the turning point in history we have now reached, which is the peculiar feature of the present political situation and which calls for a new orientation of Soviet power, i.e., for a new presentation of a new task. The first task of every party of the future is to convince the majority of the people that its program and tactics are correct. This task stood in the forefront both in Tsarist times and in the period of the Chernovs and Tseretellis, policy of compromise with the Kerenskys and Kishkins. This task has now been fulfilled in the main, for as the recent Congress of Soviets in Moscow incontrovertibly proved, the majority of the workers and peasants of Russia are obviously on the side of the Bolsheviks. But of course, it is far from being completely fulfilled, and it can never be completely fulfilled. The second task that confronted our party was to capture political power and to suppress the resistance of the exploiters. This task has not been completely fulfilled either, and it cannot be ignored because the monarchists and constitutional democrats on the one hand, and their henchmen and hangers-on, the Mensheviks and right socialist revolutionaries on the other, are continuing their efforts to unite for the purpose of overthrowing Soviet power in the main. However, the task of suppressing the resistance of the exploiters fulfilled in the period from October 25th of 1917 to approximately February 1918, or to the surrender of Bogoyevsky. A third task is now coming to the fore as the immediate task and one which constitutes the peculiar feature of the present situation, namely the task of organizing administration of Russia. Of course, we advanced and tackled this task on the very day following October 25th of 1917. Up to now, however, since the resistance of the exploiters still took the form of an open civil war, up to now the task of administration could not become the main and central task. Now it has become the main and central task. We, the Bolshevik Party, have convinced Russia. We have won Russia from the rich for the poor, from the exploiters, from the working people. Now we must administer Russia. And the whole peculiarity of the present situation, the whole difficulty lies in the understanding the specific features of the transition from the principal task of convincing the people and of suppressing the exploiters by armed force to the principal task of administration. For the first time in human history, a socialist party has managed to complete in the main the conquest of power and the suppression of the exploiters, and has managed to approach directly the task of administration. We must prove worthy executors of this most difficult and most gratifying task of the socialist revolution. We must fully realize that in order to administer successfully, besides being able to convince people, besides being able to win a civil war, we must be able to do practical organizational work. This is the most difficult task because it is a matter of organizing in a new way the most deep-rooted, the economic foundations of life of scores of millions of people. And it is the most gratifying task because only after it has been fulfilled in the principle of the main outlines will it be possible to say that Russia has become not only a Soviet but also a socialist republic. The general slogan of the moment. So that was the first part we're going to read. We're going to go ahead and get into the second part because it's short too. It's a lot shorter than the other parts. The objective situation reviewed above, which has been created by the extremely onerous and unstable peace, the terrible state of ruin, the unemployment and famine we inherited from the war and the rule of the bourgeoisie, represented by Kerensky and the Mensheviks and the right socialist revolutionaries who supported them. All this has inevitably caused extreme weariness and even exhaustion of wide sections of the working people. These people insistently demand, and cannot but demand, a respite. The task of the day is to restore the productive forces destroyed by the war and by bourgeois rule, to heal the wounds inflicted by the war, by the defeat in the war, by profiteering and the attempts of the bourgeoisie to restore the overthrown rule of the exploiters. to achieve economic revival, to provide reliable protection of elementary order. It may sound paradoxical, but in fact, considering the objective conditions indicated above, it is absolutely certain that at the present moment the Soviet system can secure Russia's transition to socialism only if these very elementary, extremely elementary problems of maintaining public life are practically solved in spite of the resistance of the bourgeoisie, the Mensheviks, and the right socialist revolutionaries. In view of the specific features of the present situation, and in view of the existence of Soviet power with its land socialization law, workers' control law, etc., the practical solution of these extremely elementary problems and the overcoming of the organizational difficulties of the first stages of progress towards socialism are now two aspects of the same picture. Keep regular and honest accounts of money, manage economically, do not be lazy, do not steal, observe the strictest labor discipline. It is these slogans, justly scorned by the revolutionary proletariat when the bourgeoisie used them to conceal its rule as an exploiting class, that are now, since the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, becoming the immediate and principal slogans of the moment. On the one hand, the practical application of these slogans by the mass of working people is the sole condition for the salvation of a country which has been tortured almost to death by the imperialist war and by the imperialist robbers, headed by Kerensky. On the other hand, the practical application of these slogans by the Soviet state, by its methods, on the basis of its laws, is a necessary and sufficient condition for the final victory of socialism. This is precisely what those who contemptuously brush aside the idea of putting such a hackneyed and trivial slogans in the forefront fail to understand. In a small peasant country which overthrew Tsarism only a year ago, and which liberated itself from the Kerenskys less than 6 months ago, there has naturally remained not a little of spontaneous anarchy, intensified by the brutality and savagery that accompany every protracted and reactionary war. And there has arisen a good deal of despair and aimless bitterness. And if we add to this the provocative policy of the lackey of the bourgeoisie, the Mensheviks, and the right socialist revolutionaries, etc., it will become perfectly clear what prolonged and persistent efforts must be exerted by the best and the most class-conscious workers and peasants in order to bring about a complete change in the mood of the people and to bring them onto the proper path of steady and disciplined labor. Only such a transition, brought about by a mass of the poor, the proletarians and semi-proletarians, can consummate the victory over the bourgeoisie, and particularly over the peasant bourgeoisie, more stubborn and numerous. Okay. Yeah, so that's the immediate task of the Soviet government. That was the first section here. The internal position of the Russian Soviet Republic and the fundamental task of the Socialist Revolution, along with the general slogan of the moment. This came out in 1918. So thank y'all for tuning in. You know, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, Medium, all of these are Marxist. Hit me up there. Y'all reach out to me. Y'all have a great day, and